He was a Christian. He lived in a Rome that was probably much more like ancient Rome than medieval Rome. It was a Rome that still probably, it's hard to say, but still probably had a population in the 6 figures. The aqueducts that kept that population up were still in working order. They wouldn't be 30 or 40 years later, but at this time they still were. So he looked around him and probably thought of himself as still living in the greatness of the Roman Empire, even though Italy was ruled by a German king. He was an official of that king, Theodoric, and fell out of favor. And when he fell out of favor and was confined to a prison waiting his execution, he wrote his most famous work, the Consolation of Philosophy. And this, along with his translations, became a classic for the rest of Western history, and certainly during the early medieval period. It was translated into a variety of languages by a great many folks, some of whom were astoundingly high up on the social register. Our speaker tonight actually has done work on these translations. One was by King Alfred the Great, who ruled England in the 9th century. Geoffrey Chaucer did a translation, and Queen Elizabeth I, I don't know about the second, but the first did a translation. So it was regarded as really a work that every educated person should read and draw wisdom from. Alas, as consoled as he might have been by philosophy, he was finally executed. And what else he might have done, we do not know. But we have an authority here, one of the country's leading authorities on Boethius, Dr. Kenneth Hawley, who is a professor of English at our neighbor higher education institution here in Lubbock, Lubbock Christian University. He did his dissertation on the translations into those various languages done by those very august people. And he is currently the director of a Boethius Center. To give it its full name, it is the Brian S. Dowie Center for Boethian Studies. And Brian S. Dowie is a man who gave a large collection of works on Boethius to LCU. So I think we're going to find out a lot of interesting things. Being a person who is sort of on the cusp of one age and sort of leaving another, Boethius was received by those who read him, but not only with a great deal of interest, but to some degree with a great deal of anxiety. And we'll hear a little more about that anxiety from Dr. Hawley. So, enough of me. Let me introduce Dr. Kenneth Hawley, and let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Balch, for this opportunity. I'm glad to be with you and glad to share some of the great legacy of Boethius with all of you tonight. Much of the focus will be initially on kind of a general introduction to his most famous work, to its message and meaning, and then we'll get into some of the English tradition especially, the translators and the translations themselves, and some of, especially as we got toward the 17th century, some anxieties about how to handle this work from a Christian who wrote on the Trinity and on the nature of the Catholic Church, but who in his most famous and last work didn't mention Jesus or the apostles or salvation by faith in a Savior. So what we're going to look at is how this Neoplatonic, natural theology, reflection on the vicissitudes of life and the certainty that can be found in the life of God was received by those who, generally speaking, believe deeply in the God that Boethius mentions, but believed in one who was a Christian God to them. And so as they read Boethius, there were some questions they never asked and some concerns they had, and we'll look at some of those together today. First, let's look at his Consolation, the Consolation of Philosophy. First, a look at his political career. As was mentioned by Steve, we have ancestors who were emperors, a father who was a consul. He himself was a consul and a senator, and in one of his greatest moments and achievements and happinesses in life, he gets to see his two sons named co-consuls in the same year that he himself is named the Master of Offices by Theodoric. And so if you wanted to think about kind of what sort of person he was or how he might have been considered by the people at large, you might think today of someone like a Kennedy or a Bush or a Roosevelt, a political dynasty of a family where everyone knew the name, everyone knew the family, and everyone knew the great power and prestige that Boethius held. And so perhaps the greater the standing, the greater the fall, as would happen soon in just another year. He would be accused of treason and thrown in prison. His service to the state, however, as we'll see in a moment, was something that he saw as essentially a fulfillment of what Plato would describe, especially in something like the allegory of the cave, which we'll mention soon. This idea that it is intended that philosophers should be kings and kings should be philosophers. And he thought that as an educated man, he owed it to the people to serve in these ways. And according to him, at least, he didn't do it for ambitious reasons, but for service to the state. That would be a kind of virtue, a virtuous duty that he would serve his people in such a way. So that when, of course, he's robbed of all those positions and powers and positions, then he feels, of course, not only mistreated, but generally, I was doing this for a very good reason, and now look at me and look at what's happened to me. Very disappointing indeed. He was a great author, writer, thinker, and not just in one or two fields, but in many. He wrote on arithmetic. He wrote on music. For centuries, his treatise on music was used in universities. Translations of Aristotle, works on logic and dialectic. But as I mentioned, he wrote explicitly religious works on the nature of the Trinity, especially important document when he served a barbarian king, Theodoric, who was himself an Arian and had an unorthodox, heretical view of the nature of Christ, and not being one with the Father. And so he writes on the Trinity. He also writes on the Catholic faith, and then before his death, he writes the Consolation of Philosophy, which, as we'll see in a moment, is basically meaning then the comfort that we get from loving wisdom. Consolation of Philosophy. So let's look at what we have here. It's a dialogue in 5 books. And the narrative frame, the fiction of it is that it is Boethius himself lamenting his losses, almost kind of waking up to the tragedy that now faces him, and being comforted by the figure of Lady Philosophy, who appears in his room, kicks out the muses who are just making things worse, and gives him now comfort from philosophy itself. And all of the dialogue in the text is essentially Boethius discussing this with philosophy, which really, of course, is just Boethius remembering everything he's learned from philosophy as a pursuit, a virtuous pursuit of learning and wisdom. And he's reminding himself through this dialogue that is a balance of both prose and verse, reminding himself of what really matters, of what shouldn't be forgotten, of what centers him in life and perhaps then in death, that would give him comfort. And it essentially also takes him from emotional turmoil to rational reflection. And that's what the dialogue is meant to do throughout the text. It is a journey then, like the journey described in Plato's allegory of the cave, that moves from darkness to light, from this confusion of man to the understanding of God. From book 1 to book 5, that's essentially the steps that he takes. Dealing then with issues like justice and injustice, fortune, fame, good and evil, providence and fate, free will, and God's foreknowledge. And trying to reconcile some of these complications. If God knows all things, if he anticipates perfectly everything that is going to happen because he knows it, then how is that not predestination? How is that not a fixed universe that can't be done about? And so he wonders and he reasons and he thinks. And essentially, even though it's through this imaginative figure of Lady Philosophy, he essentially works through these issues himself. He finds a way through his internal dialogue to process these issues and remind himself of all that he has learned and gained through his life of philosophical reflection. He lands then, ultimately in Book 5, on the eternal nature of an unchanging God, the unmoved mover, Aristotle's primum mobile. He's the one who first initiated all movement, but he himself is unmoved. And so he is able here in this treatise to share in both the Platonic tradition and the Aristotelian tradition, giving us a God above and beyond all things, who is yet somehow holding everything together and giving, through his eternally providential view of all things, free will to humans to act, to not act, and unfortunately for Boethius, for evil humans to act or not act, for Theodoric to act on him and put him in prison. So as we walk through the text itself, we might first consider the relevance of the Consolation. He spoke to it in another of his treatises, this a commentary on Porphyry. He writes here about the restorative work of philosophy, how it works upon us to bring us back to where we belong. He says the love of wisdom, or philosophy, is the illumination of the intelligent mind by that pure wisdom, here you might hear Aristotle, defined as the self-sufficient living mind and sole primeval reason of all things, a divine wisdom of sorts, and is a kind of return and recall to it, so that it seems at once the pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of divinity, and the friendship of that pure mind. That if we love wisdom, that we are in friendship with it. And wisdom itself is divine, and so we pursue divinity even as we pursue wisdom. He saw this as a complete journey that brings wholeness. This wisdom then gives the whole class of minds that pursue it a reward. The reward is its own divinity, and returns it to its proper constitution and purity of nature. As Aristotle would say, reason is the most divine thing in us, and it is the thing that distinguishes us from the animals and that draws us back to God, because what is the highest thing that a rational animal can contemplate? That would be God himself. And in contemplating God himself, we return to him in that Platonic sense. And so this is how Boethius conceived of how philosophy works before he wrote the Consolation. And then now here we'll find it as we read the Consolation. But first, a few questions. We start to think about how relevant the Consolation might have been through the ages. As was mentioned, I have now this center that is surrounding me as I work, and in every case, there is example after example. Latin editions, English translations, Italian translations, French translations, all of them testifying to the fact that somebody found this useful. Somebody was comforted enough by it to say, not only have I been comforted by it, but I want to make it available to others who wouldn't otherwise be able to access it through the Latin. And so they translate it into a language that can be understood. And perhaps it's those who are struggling with their own disappointment, loss, sorrow. The fact that immoral people are getting away with things, as Boethius would say in Book 1, Meter 5. That the powerful are triumphing over the weak. That some, like Boethius, have lost their positions, their possessions, their power. Everything that made them popular, everything that made them great, everything that they thought they were, has been taken from them. And perhaps there's some who would still want to believe in a good creator, but are making sense, trying to make sense of a world that is sad as we look at all the evil that consumes it. Maybe we're wondering then how happiness can be found in a life full of suffering. Or how do we make sense out of what seems senseless? What about God's nature, his power, his will? What about when it seems like prayers may be going nowhere and changing nothing? If we live in a fixed universe, then what is the point of hoping or praying? As we'll say in Book 4, and as he'll answer in Book 5. Maybe some might want to blame God for what he must have caused. And so as Boethius is working through what's happened to him, he has to think through some of these darker moments when he considers that, is it possible that God has caused this thing to happen to me for some reason or other? And how can I make sense of that? And his Consolation attempts to get at what some answers to those questions might be. So, the Consolation and its message. It begins, as I mentioned, in Plato's allegory of the cave. And just to briefly review, we have, of course, prisoners chained, fixed, always on the back of the cave. Very much in a room like this, in fact. Shadows being cast on the back wall. And yet, they would be imprisoned in such a way that they couldn't move their necks, couldn't leave. But if one were to be freed, perhaps they would leave this position and go and eventually find that there's a projector in the middle. Well, for him it was a firelight. And that firelight was casting shadows on the back wall. And if somehow, even through the pain of seeing more light than he's ever seen before, that prisoner was able to make his way out of the cave and travel up the ascent where diffused sunlight was pouring through, he might then find outside the cave a real sun. A sun that represents in the allegory perfect truth, beauty, justice, goodness, the ideal forms. Whoever God must be, this is perfection. And anyone who then escapes, now knowing more than has ever been known before, just might be tempted to never go back in, But the point of his allegory is, as we mentioned before, his political service, those who know must return to the cave and enlighten those who do not know. And that's how he makes the case for a life of service for the state, for kings to be philosophers. But living in that darkness, they can't see any different. And as the structure of the Consolation works, he begins in Book 1 at the back of the cave, frustrated, fallen, in darkness, in mist. His neck bends low and shackles thrust, and he is forced beneath the weight to contemplate the lowly dust, he says in the second poem of the first book. That's what it's like. In many cases, the poems that intersperse with the prose are delivered by the figure of Lady Philosophy. She says, "I'll comfort you now with a song." And this is her description of someone stuck in darkness. And again, when light comes, the night was put to flight, the darkness fled into my eyes, their former strength returned. And Boethius is beginning to have his sight return to him. She lifts him up, philosophy raises him, dries the tears from his eyes, and begins to counsel him in ways that would give him light to see by. In the same way, the clouds of my grief dissolve, and I drink in the light, he says in the next prose section. And so he clearly identifies his journey as a Platonic one, out of the cave, out of the darkness, and toward the light. And that's where he's heading through the narrative structure of the work. It's also, in terms of Platonic ideas, a journey of recollection, this emenesis, that he is recalling those things he's always kind of known somehow. And he's not necessarily learning something new so much as remembering something he should have always known. And through the figure of Lady Philosophy, remembering what she had taught him. And so as he's lost such things, power, position, wealth, prestige, fame, she has to counsel him, those things you lost were never true goods in the first place. But friendship, family, father-in-law, these are goods that you still possess. No good thing harms its owner. That's her definition. And unfortunately, wealth, power, prestige, they're often harmful. In fact, with power and positions, she says, many times when a person is given a rank or position, it's not that their best qualities are then revealed, but their worst qualities are then revealed. They don't make better the men who achieve such positions. And so power and position are not true goods. And then on fame, he had been quite famous. And this is a very ironic section, because she'll say, you really can't expect a citizen of Rome and his name to go where Rome itself has not gone. How could you possibly be famous throughout the whole world? And yet here we are, thousands of miles away, talking about him 1,500 years later. But many men, they were famous during their lifetime, but now forgotten because no one wrote about them. Even the written records are of limited value, since the long passage of time veils them and their authors in obscurity. You start thinking about your future fame, what you need to keep in mind is eternity itself. Even finite time, 10,000 years, that's a long time, but it's still finite and nothing compared to the vastness of eternity. So what satisfaction can you have about the power of your name? At every turn, she keeps coming back to this idea of God's eternity being the one thing that helps put everything in perspective, and especially here, the nature of fame. And so, at the middle point of the work, at the most famous poem, Book 3, Meter 9, it concludes with these lines, as she is counseling him to now turn his eyes toward God, the source and fount of light and goodness, to see thee, the Creator God, as she begins the whole work. It's often called the hymn to the Creator. To see thee is our end, who art our source and maker, Lord, and path, and goal. Almost reminiscent of Christ saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life here. I'm not just the one who is telling you to go, I'm the path that you go. And not just the path that you're going on, I am the destination you're headed toward. Everything all together and at once is God for Boethius at this moment when he's finally turning his eyes fully toward God. He's not fully reconciled. Some of the hardest questions come next, but he knows that he's going to seek those answers from God. On blessedness, then, what it means to truly be happy. Sometimes the English translations in this section get a little muddled. Too much emphasis on happiness and not on a truer translation of blessedness. Since it is through the possession of happiness that people become happy, and since happiness is in fact divinity, it is clear that it is through the possession of divinity that they become happy. Again, it sounds like Aristotle. How would happiness be found? By contemplating God, the highest thing that can be contemplated by a rational animal. And that through this pursuit of God, through philosophy, this divine pursuit leads to blessedness and happiness. Now thinking of Theodoric, the one who put him in prison after all, he might start thinking, you know, I really can't believe people like that get away with it. But Lady Philosophy counsels him to remember that powerful people are often quite weak. She says, here in one heart, thinking of a tyrant, so many tyrants rule in the heart of a tyrant. The king's own will is deposed, the enslaver enslaved, and gives examples of things like lust and hatred and greed and violence. Just because a tyrant wields power doesn't mean he is free in his heart. And then in a famous treatment of Circe and Odysseus and his men, Boethius retells this moment of metamorphosis. And the men are transformed, but given some help by Hermes, Odysseus escapes. And it describes then how all these men are transformed into these animals, but their minds are still intact. And she concludes the whole story by saying, those poisons are stronger, though, which creeping deep within, dethrone a man's true self. They don't harm the body, but cruelly wound the mind. And soon leads to a passage about how there are plenty of people walking around today who are animalistic in their every instinct, but they still look like humans. That's the worst thing. When you still look human, and yet your mind has been corrupted by evil. Trying to convince Boethius, of course, that yes, there are people out there who do terrible things, and are terrible. And you can usually tell. What's worse is when some turmoil has gone on inside their minds that others cannot see. Then, reaching one of the more climactic moments philosophically, gets to the difference between fate and providence. And here you see a Ptolemaic model of the universe. It's helpful because the key image that Lady Philosophy uses to explain this is concentric circles. Everything is the freer from fate, the closer it seeks the center of things. Imagine then concentric circles with a still point in the middle, and out from that center, concentric circles. And the farther you go from the center, the more upheaval you have. And you might here think of Fortune's wheel. King Alfred the Great, when he translated this passage, was also thinking of a wheel because he changed it completely from an image of concentric circles to an image of a wagon wheel. He describes the wagon wheel turning. And you might know people like this perhaps, who at the beginning of the day are quite happy and jovial, then something goes wrong, and all of a sudden they're flinging to the outside, overturned by fate and all its workings, overturned so easily. But the nearer we draw to the center of things, we then are closer to providence. And the difference between the unstable course of fate and the stable simplicity of providence is like that between reasoning and understanding. You know, between trying to figure out a problem and actually solving it. There's a lot of turmoil in trying to figure out a problem, a lot of peace in solving it. Between that which is coming into being and that which is. Just think of puberty. That which is coming into being. All kinds of chaos and turmoil. But that which is, that which has matured. Between time and eternity. Between the moving circle and the still point in the middle. And that image of the difference between time and eternity is going to be a key distinction between fate and providence. Fate, the unfolding in time of all that has been foreseen, and providence, all that is foreseen. The interesting bit here, by having the Ptolemaic model nearby, is with the earth in the center and God dwelling out there somewhere, what Boethius has done by using a similar image is flipped it, where God is the still point in the center. The simple providential mind is in the center, and humans who are on various levels of distance from him experience greater loss and difficulty the further they are from him, and greater stability and security and simplicity the nearer they draw to him. So again, on fate and providence, he gives another image for us to try to picture what this might be like. He says they're different, but one depends on the other. The order of fate is derived from the simplicity of providence. And he gives an example here. A craftsman anticipates in his mind the plan of the thing he's going to make, and then sets in motion the execution of the work, and carries out in time the construction of what he's seen all at once, at one moment present to his mind's eye. I don't know if you've ever helped someone who is really good at building things, and you yourself are perhaps not, but this sort of thing happens all the time. My father-in-law can see all at once what's going to happen, and I'm just following along and keeping up and trying to hit the right thing at the right time and hold the right thing in the right way. But he can see all at once what's going to happen, and I'm not sure what the next step is, much less what the 5th, 6th, and 10th step is going to be. but in one mind he can see it all at once. And this is the image that Boethius gives here for how God can see many things at once that we only see unfolding in time. And perhaps at any given moment, you're the nail being hit by the hammer and figure out what's going on here and not seeing the larger picture of what is taking place. Then on God's foreknowledge, gives the example of the sun as being not as good as God. If you want to see the sun as something great, just realize that it can only light half the world at any one time. It can't light to the bottom of the oceans, but God himself can see and know all things at once. What is, what was, what is to be, in one swift glance his mind can see. There is not one act that says, I'm going to stop now and remember, and another act that says, I will stop now and predict. There is just the ever-present now in which he knows all. So then, his definition of eternity, a definition that lived on throughout the Middle Ages and became kind of a key definition of how to understand divine eternity, is that it is the complete, simultaneous, and perfect possession of everlasting life. That the contrast, of course, with us might be, we don't completely even know all the days of our lives. Can't remember what we had done many years ago, have no idea what we'll do years from now. But in God, there is a complete, simultaneous, and perfect possession of everlasting life. Nothing slipping away from him like it slips away from us, forgotten to time. And nothing so far out of our reach that we can't yet conceive of it because it's future to us. But all things seen simultaneously at once. Then a key distinction. In trying to figure out how in the world God can see all these things, and somehow that doesn't mean that it's all fixed and there's nothing we can do about it, he gives this example and this key distinction between simple necessity and conditional necessity. When you see, at the very same time, a man walking on the earth and the sun rising in the sky, although the two sides coincide, yet you distinguish between them, and you judge the one to be willed and the other necessitated. In the same way, the divine gaze looks down on all things without disturbing their nature. To him they are present things, but under the condition of time, they are future things. So, if we see, and you will soon see, people walking away from here, your seeing them walk away isn't imposing any will on them. It's not saying that they must. You're witnessing it. It is beneath your sight. It is beneath your providential understanding. He also says, I leave it now as a relic of his honest mind, reposing his trust in Almighty God. He can raise up those who are cast down, and at least by this posterity will know how and in what unhappy times, and for what cause it was, the storm came upon him and ruined him, and learn to decline the fondness of this mutable world and seek the never-fading treasure. Again, it sounds like a sermon here. I'm offering this to all those who would read it so they would seek the treasures that never fail. And then we have Lord Viscount Preston. He was Sir Richard Graham, then named Lord Viscount by James II. He was envoy extraordinary. He was Secretary of State, but because of political intrigue, found himself in the Tower of London. Later got captured at sea, but because he confessed everything, he got released and was pardoned. And in his preface to his translation, it comes out in 1695. So over those years, some believe he had already started it and then revised it, or maybe he just started it here in the 1690s. He's talking about Boethius, but he's also talking about himself. He from whom fortune hath withdrawn her kinder influences, and upon whom those who under God govern the world do not think fit to shine, whatever his merits may have been before, will find himself exposed to all the injuries which his superiors, equals, or inferiors shall think good to heap upon him. People like me, people like Boethius, we're going to suffer when powerful people have their way. These are the ordinary turns of providence to which all men ought to submit, as those who are endowed with piety and good sense do with willingness. He sees it as religious devotion to submit to providence, not just philosophical reflection. Ever making the right use of them without being surprised. And if you can do this, this will make the worst of evils, banishment or even death, like Boethius, to be endured with cheerfulness by men of great souls. They determine that the persecution of this world, very religious phrase, is to be the last proof of their patience and fidelity, and that when that is at an end, their virtue shall be rewarded and crowned. Heaven itself, reward for the faithful. That's how they're seeing it. Personal turmoil, they go to Boethius and find in him hope of heaven. Some way to make sense of this mess and look toward God eternally, not just here and now. The last item for us tonight is this. There was a review of his translation. It was coming out soon, and they reviewed it in the November issue of Miscellaneous Letters. And notice how it's phrased. The person who wrote this knew his Boethius and is just shocked that other people don't. They must be altogether strangers in the commonwealth of learning who are not acquainted with the immortal work of Boethius. As are most of us and most of the world, strangers in the commonwealth of learning. And I cannot wonder enough that so useful a book has been so long slighted that since Chaucer's time, nobody has been invited to give it an English dress. He hadn't read his Coningsby. He had no idea about Elizabeth. He didn't know about IT. He didn't know about Bracegirdle. He didn't know about Colville. A half a dozen translations he had no idea of. But he knew that Boethius was important. And he's surprised, perhaps talking with a few friends of his, that some people don't know who he is. And he thinks that it should be translated into English. The noble author of this translation has therefore mightily obliged the world, presenting us with this version. Nay, he's put a great obligation upon Boethius himself, for this is excellent proof that this work is answerable to its title, that it can console as we pursue wisdom. It affords consolations in the most sad circumstances. It's interesting that back in 1695, they thought that no one knew the Boethius well enough. It's a position that we're in today, and a position where, similarly, we may not know how many other people knew their Boethius and how many other translations are out there. And so, the work of our society, the International Boethius Society, the work of the Donahue Center, is to try to make sure it doesn't get forgotten and do our part as best we can, digitizing some of these old editions and translations, to try to make more widely available this work that King Alfred the Great had once said was most necessary for men to know. This work that for centuries people had on their shelves, people had in their hearts, and from the editions that we've got there in the center, a number of them, just small little pocket editions they carried around and read, consoling themselves, reorienting themselves. As Boethius saw it, philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom was a way to reorient ourselves to what we should already know and remember, things that matter the most, bringing us comfort then in the face of the most sad circumstances. Thank you.
Questions?
I'm wondering how much Augustine the free will and
Right.
providence is
Yeah.
very much.
I believe that you would have known him quite well, read him, and probably used him whenever he could.
What's the side of it?
Citation might be too specific a scholarly term, but influenced by, surely, like Proclus, Porphyry, others, influenced by all those. And he would have been, in his day, one of the most well-read persons anywhere, and would have known as Augustine as well as anyone would have known.
So, is anything in his view of free will and providence different from Augustine?
I think what Boethius is known for is situating it firmly within this idea of eternal, God's eternal presence. That's what kind of solidifies the Boethian legacy. That whatever Augustine was working through, Boethius situated in his narrative. And part of what makes Boethius' narrative powerful is that it was his life. And connecting it then to a biography, that's what makes Augustine fascinating in Confessions. Connecting it to a human flesh and blood life makes some of his considerations more palpable. That he's trying to make sense of these confusing ideas, but for Boethius takes those notions of human free will and tries to prove that we have free will on the virtue of our reason. Again, think of Milton. Reason itself is choice. We have free will because we are rational animals and have the capacity to choose between the two. That's how Boethius framed it.
Do they know how it got from him into, why did the author who was speaking not just find it and tear it up?
That may be a mystery for some time. It was known by people like Alcuin. It was known by people like Alfred because churchmen maintained it. And it was used in the training of churchmen. It It was used in the education of churchmen, and it was used then by educated churchmen in the training of people like King Alfred the Great. And that's probably the only way that anything like that would have survived.
And some churchmen kind of took it and...
Probably especially ones that appreciated his opposition to the Arian theology. Supposition, but it makes sense.
Yes, sir. I'm wondering, how would you equate like Boethius' opinion towards someone, say like Immanuel Kant's idea that a supreme being can only be considered so if he wills himself to be like put forth in front of the supreme tribunal of like critical reason?
Well,
It's difficult to imagine what he would say to modern or modernist and postmodernist thinkers. But what you have is someone who knew already, thought already, believed already that a God existed. And that God was, for him, the fullest expression of everything that was good and everything that was real. And as he imagined it, whatever his suffering, his difficulty, his suffering and hardship, it had to be, if there was any sense to be made of it at all, it would be made sense of in the sight of and through the sight of God. And that's why he takes us through that in books 4 and 5 to this position where God is in the position that he's in. And it works like many Platonic dialogues where you can kind of see that the fix is in. You believe this, don't you? Oh yes, I believe it is so. And all of it also we have to remember is his own thinking. And so he is telling us how he is thinking. And he's explaining his own complications and confusions. But he's not going to openly contradict himself as he works through this, but find a way to make sense of, as best he can, this puzzling idea that if there is a God who oversees everything, then the buck stops with him. And the closest he can come to that is that just because he sees it doesn't mean he's to blame for it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Could you like interpret Boethius as someone who sort of explained the reason behind why God is the supreme being?
I think that if there was an explanation for it as such, it would be because he is the one who must be perfectly good, who must be perfectly wise. And again, he gets playful in that Platonic dialogue where he'll say things like, well, God can do anything, right? Can God do evil? No. Then evil is nothing. And that's one of those points where, hey, wait a minute, Boethius, you're playing tricks with us. He will find a way to establish the supremacy of God so that when he gets to book 5, he's kind of expecting people to be on board with him already. So that when he gets to the point where he can say something like, everyone can agree that God is eternal, right? Yes, certainly. That's the extent of it, right? And now he's done some work to establish God in that position already, but it's almost always from a position of already thinking those things, because the entire narrative is he's remembering things he's already thought before. And so it doesn't have the same kind of structure or kind of rhetorical purpose that other philosophical treatises to get at things might have, but instead is reflective and personal in its expression of what truths he's come to know. And again, fascinatingly, through the years, many people who have approached him, of course, haven't asked some of the questions that might be asked of them in other circles and other circumstances, but have already thought some of those same things themselves and go to the Consolation believing that there must be a divine answer for these things and hoping to find some help in getting there. But they're already a good ways along in their approach to the problem being one that says there must be an answer to be found in God, and taking many things for granted.
So rather than being a treatise on proving why the divine must exist or why free will must exist and things of that nature, it's more so that the belief in God must be properly basic because free will exists and because the world exists as it is.
Kind of reasoning the other way to it, yeah. Sir?
I'm puzzled about the translators that wanted to Christianize him, had a 6th book and so on. They thought he was really important, and his consolations were worth translating. yet they thought it was a failure in some sense, and so they had to add something to it.
Yeah, and it's one way that you could approach a lot of the Christianizing, whether it's throwing in a passage here or a line there, like in Walton, or with some of these 17th century translations. A lot of the passages that I quoted for you tonight were in their prefatory materials, right? And in their explanation for what they're doing and why they're doing it, and why you should keep reading. Right? You only got through the first few pages. Keep reading my work. Please buy the whole thing before you hit the bookshop. They're trying to say, now you might think that this doesn't cover things the way you want them to be covered. It may not get into it the way that Minister so-and-so might, but make sure you read all the way to the end. And when you get there, you might think that he didn't go the full measure. And I admit that if he were to write a sixth book, it probably would have done this, and this. But he didn't, and it's a pity that he didn't. But here it is, and it's fully consistent with Scriptures. And it seems as though a number of people in fairly tight religious circles were trying to cover all their bases and make sure that people didn't think that they were kind of going off the deep end, reading stuff they shouldn't be reading, and resorting to answers to questions or problems that were outside of scriptural authority. And so they were nervous about that. That's where some of that anxiety was coming from, it seems. And in some cases, they were specifically concerned about actual heresies at the time. So that Henry Somerset, 1693, he has a passage where he talks about how he's afraid, even as he's translating it, he's afraid that some people, the Socinians, might take comfort in the Consolation of Philosophy. And the reason he's concerned is because the Socinian sect, this heretical group, was trying to say that reason alone, and only reason, was how we approached and knew God. And because it's a kind of treatise that sort of does that, he said, I'm afraid Socinians might take comfort in this, and so I'm going to make sure I situate this properly. Right? And so sometimes they're actively concerned about religious controversies in their day, and they're trying to make sure that Boethius is read the right way, by the right people in the right ways, Aristotelian.